Hi, guys. Today we're going to take a look at the continuation of colonization in North America, moving beyond just the Spanish to look at some of the other European countries who were also engaging in colonizing North America from 1500 to 1664. So let's take a look at the French. Specifically, the French were a little late starting in on the colonization game compared to the Spanish or even the English for that matter. Um, the French had been dealing with some problems of their own at home, specifically religious issues within the country between the majority Catholic population and the Protestant Huguenots among them in the minority. Um, after the French Huguenots were massacred on St. Bartholomew's Day, France started focusing more and more on colonizing. And there are two main colonies that France focused on. First, up in what we call Canada today, when Samuel de Champlain, the um, French explorer, founded a permanent settlement at Quebec along the St. Lawrence River, which gives them access to the ocean eventually, and also down in the Caribbean in what was called then the French West Indies. Now, up in Canada, in the New France, as it was called at the time, they were allied with the Huron tribe. This is a common way to gain a foothold in a new area. Now, since the Hurons were the enemies of the Iroquois lived in upstate New York, or what is today upstate New York. That's going to be important later on when we start talking about the French and Indian War. But just know for now that the French are working alongside the Huron, specifically to hunt beaver and for the beaver pelts, which was the main focus of the economy up in New France. Now, down in the French West Indies, down in the Caribbean, the primary focus was on sugarcane, and which obviously is a much more valuable commodity for France. Now, the French, their foothold up in New France, what we call Canada today, it was a royal colony controlled by the King of France. And it was much more slow growing compared to their English or Spanish counterpart. Predominantly, it is much more spread out. All of what we would consider Canada today, part of the middle of the United States, all the way down to Louisiana. And there's not that many people, that many French people living there because, number one, the people who might choose to immigrate for maybe religious safe haven like those Huguenots were not allowed to leave France. And if you were a French person at this time looking to colonize or move to the New World, and your choice is between being a beaver trapper up in Canada or possibly growing sugarcane down in the West Indies, which is much more valuable, that was their primary focus. So think of New France as very, very spread out and very sparsely populated. Here you see the land that they claimed, that's in green. Compare that to the yellow along the eastern coast of the Atlantic Ocean. That was the English claim. And then obviously down in Mexico, Central America, part of South America, and obviously parts of the Caribbean were the Spanish. Like I said, the primary focus among the French up in Canada was beaver trapping. Beaver furs were all the rage fashion wise back in Europe. And so they are using the Native American tribes to recruit them into this trade. As just an example, in 1693, it was recorded 400 Native American canoes filled with beaver pelts leaving Montreal in order to be shipped out to back to Europe. This is also going to decimate the beaver population. They were hunted to near extinction. Um, but because they are utilizing Native Americans in this trade, there's a lot of back and forth going on, part of that Columbian exchange. And part of the deal what the French are providing is they are trading alcohol, they're trading weapons. And obviously, disease is spreading among these Native American tribes up in modern day Canada, just like we saw among the Spanish, and just like we are going to see eventually when we talk about the English. That is definitely going to weaken these Native American populations because, like as we said before, 90% death rate among those Native tribes. But their expanse goes far to the west, like we saw on the map before, and all the way down to modern day Louisiana. The port at New Orleans was a primary shipping route out to the Atlantic Ocean. And some of the big names that we know when we think of the French um, uh, colonizers like Antoine Cadillac, he founded the city of Detroit. Robert LaSalle. He claimed the Mississippi River all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and that is going to be important later on. The country who controls the Mississippi River has a huge, huge advantage on their side because that is a natural flow of goods down the Mississippi River, out through the Gulf of Mexico, and out to the Atlantic Ocean. So at this point, it's the French controlling that very important port at New Orleans and controlling the Mississippi River. Here you see some of these French trading posts spread throughout, and like I said, very sparsely populated. They are working with the Native American tribes, which is a different reaction than the Spanish had to the Native Americans, and as we'll see, a very different reaction than what the English have to the Native Americans in their colonies. But the death rate is still the same among those native tribes. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and now take a look at the English colonizing in the New World. So back in England, we see King Henry VIII, and maybe if you remember from European history, he decides he wants to divorce his Catholic wife, Catherine of Aragon. She can't or doesn't produce a male heir for him. This jumpstarts a Protestant Reformation over in England. He leaves the Church of England and founds the Church of England. Sometimes it's referred to as the Anglican Church. Um, this is going to increase the rivalry that already existed between England and Spain for several reasons. Number one, Spain is a very Catholic country. And number two, the queen that he kicked out was originally from Spain. She had been the daughter of King Ferdinand and Isabella. So that's only going to accentuate or exacerbate that rivalry between England and Spain. Now, the English are chomping at the bit to get in on this colonization game over in North and South America. They see all of the wealth that the Spanish are pulling out of the New World, all that gold, all that silver that is being dragged out of Central and South America. And so they are anxious to get in on this as well. Under Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth, she is going to use what were called sea dogs, better known as pirates, in order to plunder some of these Spanish ships to start gaining some wealth for the English crown. And in 1588, the Spanish Armada, this naval fleet, was destroyed by the English. This marks the beginning or the ascension of English naval superiority, and it's also going to mark the beginning of their attempts at colonization. We see a strong national identity created over in England, and this desire to really prove themselves compared to the Spanish. Um, so the first attempt at a colony by the English actually failed. This was in Roanoke, near the modern day Outer Banks. Sir Walter Raleigh had founded this colony. He went back to England to gain more funding. When he came back, poof, they were gone. Nobody knows what happened to this failed colony at Roanoke, also in Newfoundland for that matter as well. But the population back in England continues to grow, and especially among a certain farmer class, there is some economic downturn. And so this almost extra population needs somewhere to go. And so there are more people willing to give up everything back in England and try their luck as a colonizer over in the New World. So, that in addition to the creation of what are called joint stock companies. This is essentially what we would think of as a corporation, right? Investors put their money together to build a ship, to hire colonizers, and they ship them off to found a colony. The colony then becomes the product, and those people that are founding that colony, they have to turn a profit or else risk being abandoned by the joint stock company, because this is all about the profit for those shareholders. So this is going to be one of the primary methods that the English use in order to grow colonies over in the New World. Here you see Queen Elizabeth, the golden age of the British monarchy. Okay. And so the first successful English colony, the one that actually survives, that lasts, that marks the beginning of the English in North America, is Jamestown. The Virginia Company of London was a joint stock company founded in London and obviously raised money in order to establish a colony to try to make money like they saw the Spanish were doing down in the Caribbean and Central and South America. So Jamestown was founded officially in 1607 along the James River in what is today Virginia. But life is very, very difficult for these Jamestown settlers. They come in and they are completely unprepared for life as a colonist. They thought they were going to get off the boat and gold would just be laying all over the shores. They didn't bring the necessary equipment that they needed to actually found a permanent settlement. They brought stuff to find gold. And so the first year especially was extremely difficult for these Jamestown's colonists. In fact, it was called the starving time because they were dying in droves. Because they were too busy looking for gold and not establishing a permanent settlement, growing crops, etc. In 1608, one of these colonists, John Smith, established martial law within the colony of Jamestown. Either you work or you don't eat. The military is now in control. And John Smith, and everyone knows the fanciful story of him being, quote, saved by the Princess Pocahontas from the local tribe, the Powhatan Confederacy. But this kind of happened, but most historians agree that Pocahontas saving John Smith was more of a dramatic thing to try to create an alliance between the local tribe, the Powhatan Confederacy, and these new English who have, come into the neighborhood, so to speak. So there is almost an uneasy truce between the English at Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy, mostly because the English need the Powhatan Native Americans to help them survive this starving time. But as time goes on, and by the spring of 1610, more reinforcements arrive from England, in addition to a new governor, Lord de la Warr. He brings with him a very harsh military regime and a focus on expelling the Native Americans from the area. There's not a focus on working with the Native Americans. It's very much about who's going to control the land. And so this marks a continuous downturn in relationships, the relationship between the English and the Native Americans. That is one of the hallmarks of the English relationship with Native Americans is complete rejection over gaining and controlling this land. Here you see the founding of Jamestown in modern day Virginia. So this peace that had existed in the very, very beginning between the Powhatan Confederacy and the Jamestown settlers is obviously strained as more and more white settlers come in, taking over more and more land. And ultimately, De La Warr is going to use what were called Irish tactics to completely try to destroy the Native American tribes, similar to how they had gained control over Ireland. And so this marks the beginning of the First Anglo-Powhatan War, one of many wars between English settlers and Native Americans over control of the land. This first Anglo-Powhatan War resulted in burning and destroying Native American villages, but finally ended in 1614 with a peace between the marriage of the Princess Pocahontas to an English settler at Jamestown named John Rolfe. Remember that name. John Rolfe is going to be important here later on. But it's very strained. And there is almost this continuous, or what was called perpetual war without peace or truce. And ultimately, the peace disintegrated, and a second Anglo Powhatan War sprang up in 1644. There is no focus on assimilating the Native Americans by the English, similar to how the Spanish had done. There is no focus on working with the Native American tribes, how the French had done. It's all about getting them out of here, or as historians say, using the 3 Ds to their advantage. The disease, the smallpox, the measles that is killing off the Native American populations makes it easier for the English to take over. The fact that these Native American tribes are disorganized, that there's almost infighting amongst themselves, and the fact that these white English settlers viewed the Native Americans as almost disposable. Get them out of here, free up the land for more white settlement. That is the hallmark of the English colonizing effort and their relationship with Native American tribes. So, the arrival of the Europeans, whether they were Spanish or French or English or Dutch or Swedish or whoever, there are some similarities between them, regardless of which European colonizer is coming in. It is going to lead to absolute upheaval among the Native American tribes, massive demographic and cultural changes. That Columbian exchange continues on. The introduction of horses, of firearms, of diseases is absolutely going to change the landscape, the social, the political, the economic landscape of these Native American tribes over in New France and the English colonies along the East Coast as well. Tribes were competing with one another in order to gain favor with these English tribes for trading purposes. So instead of working together to expel the Europeans, there's almost infighting amongst themselves. And those epidemics are still killing 90% of the Native American tribes. So it's a similar story, and it leads us to understanding how the English were able to easily take over the eastern seaboard of what is today modern day United States. Now, further inland, before more whites settled in the inland part of what is today the United States, some of those tribes were successful at forcing white settlers to assimilate to their way of life, simply because they didn't have the strength in numbers. But as Europeans continue to push inland into North America, that obviously changes as well. So, the last European settlement that we're going to look at today, and we'll talk more about all of these guys again later, are the Dutch, the Netherlands, establishing their own colonies in the New World. And similar to the French, the primary focus of the Dutch in the New World was down in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, because sugar was much more valuable compared to anything else going on. And so, New Netherlands, in what is today modern day New York, was kind of a second thought to the Dutch government, to the Dutch people. It wasn't their first priority. Their first priority was more focused on the Caribbean and the sugar cane that they were able to grow down there. And so it was easily conquered by the English. King Charles II, the English king, granted a land grant to his brother, the Duke of York, basically said, hey, New Netherlands is kind of just sitting, waiting to be taken over. The Dutch aren't really guarding this colony very, very well. Why don't you go over and see what happens? And so the Duke of York shows up over in what is today New York Harbor, um, and is able to somewhat easily take this colony, this new colony that the Dutch had recently created, from the Dutch. And with that, with the loss of New York to the Dutch and now it becomes New York, named after the Duke of York. The English now control all the way from New England, which we'll talk about those colonies in the next chapter, all the way down to the Carolinas, which we'll also talk about in the next chapter as well. They're controlling the eastern seaboard. Contrast that to the French, who control modern day Canada and the western portion of west of the Mississippi River all the way down to New Orleans. And even though New York is now an English colony, there are definitely some cultural holdovers from when the Dutch controlled it. Um, they remained a very aristocratic style colony, similar to how the Dutch had controlled it. Wall Street remains in place in what had been New Amsterdam and today becomes New York City. So even though it becomes an English colony, there are some still Dutch residue, as it said, in the now created colony of New England. And that is it for chapter 2, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.